The air over Oak Ridge Landing hung thick and pregnant, a heavy perfume of freshly mown fescue mingling with the sharp, metallic promise of an overdue thunderstorm. This subdivision, carved with Euclidean precision from rolling fields where cows once grazed, was a monument to beige siding, beige trim, beige mailboxes conforming to Regulation 7B. Uniformity wasn't just a preference here. It was enshrined in the weighty tome of Homeowners Association covenants, a document wielding the quiet tyranny of approved lawn heights and forbidden fence materials. My father, Frank Miller, had sought out this beige monotony, craved it like a starving man craves bread. 30 years commanding an FBI hostage rescue team unit had etched lines onto his face and silence into his soul. He'd spent a lifetime navigating the lethal labyrinth of barricaded suspects, talking down men whose desperation smelled like sweat and cheap explosives, feeling the bone-jarring thump-thump of flashbangs echo long after the smoke cleared. Now, he wanted nothing more than to trade the familiar weight of Kevlar for the unfamiliar comfort of gardening gloves, the staccato urgency of tactical briefings for the quiet satisfaction of coaxing tomatoes from the earth, or meticulously restoring the gleaming chrome heart of his vintage Triumph motorcycle in the cool sanctuary of the garage. 6 months into retirement, adrift in the vast, uncharted territory of unscheduled days, the fiercest battle he'd faced was against a particularly insidious patch of crabgrass. Then came Gary Shipley. Gary Shipley. Even the name felt flimsy, inadequate for the sheer, baffling force of misplaced authority and simmering resentment the man radiated. Gary held no official HOA title, not president, not treasurer, not even committee member, as far as anyone could ascertain. Yet, he navigated Oak Ridge Landing with the puffed-up arrogance of a man who believed he owned the very air rights above the perfectly aligned rooftops. Middle-aged, with a face perpetually flushed, either from exertion or chronic indignation. It was hard to tell, and eyes that seemed to bulge slightly behind thick-rimmed glasses. Gary was a caricature of petty power. He'd somehow acquired an HOA logo polo shirt, stretched taut across his considerable girth, and a laminated ID card dangling from a lanyard around his neck. Community Standards Monitor, it proclaimed, a title as official as a cardboard crown. He flashed this credential often, with the solemnity of an agent revealing classified documents. His preferred mode of transport was a golf cart, slightly dented, customized with a single, cheap amber strobe light bolted precariously to its roof. In this absurd chariot, he conducted his relentless patrols, scanning the manicured streetscape for infractions, real or more often, creatively interpreted. Newcomers, unsettling the delicate ecosystem of established conformity, were his particular obsession. And my father, quiet, observant, possessed of a stillness born of unimaginable pressures, apparently registered as a significant anomaly on Gary's radar. Subject presents as middle-aged male, elevated agitation, seeking validation through perceived authority. Dad might have assessed internally, the old habits of observation dying hard. Motivation, likely insecurity, need for control. Recommend minimal engagement, avoid provocation. That detached analysis likely informed his reaction to their first real encounter. Gary, hammering on the front door at precisely 7:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Miller, your recycling receptacle is positioned 3.5 inches beyond the designated curbside placement zone. Violation of Waste Management Protocol, Section 4, Paragraph C." Dad had opened the door, listened with the same patient, neutral expression he'd once employed facing down men screaming threats through barricaded doors. He nodded slowly, his gaze calm. Okay, Gary, thanks for letting me know. I'll make sure to correct that for next week's pickup. This placid acceptance, this utter refusal to be drawn into Gary's manufactured drama, seemed to act like gasoline on a smoldering fire. Gary visibly bristled. He craved the friction, the argument, the raised voices that would legitimize his role as enforcer. Dad, a man whose entire professional life revolved around de-escalating volatile situations, offered him nothing but polite, infuriating calm. He treated Gary's pronouncements like background noise, noted but not engaged. There were other encounters, each chipping away at the neighborhood's veneer of tranquility. Gary, appearing seemingly out of nowhere while Dad was mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. Brandishing a cheap decibel meter app on his phone, engine noise exceeds 70 decibels at property line. Violation of acoustic comfort bylaw. Addendum 333, he declared triumphantly. Appreciate you looking out for the neighborhood peace, Gary. Dad had replied mildly, cutting the engine. He wiped sweat from his temple with the back of his hand. Wouldn't want to cause a disturbance. He then calmly wheeled the mower towards the garage, leaving Gary standing on the sidewalk, looking deflated and vaguely confused. The decibel meter still glowing uselessly in his hand. Then the note started. Typed. Anonymous missives left under the truck's windshield wiper, tucked into the motorcycle cover. Accusations couched in passive-aggressive language. It has been noted that the recreational vehicle cover remains in public view for extended periods following use. Prompt garaging is appreciated by residents who value Oak Ridge Landing's aesthetic standards. Dad would read them, sigh softly, and toss them in the recycling bin, the properly positioned one. He's getting worse, Dad, I said one evening. We were sitting on the back patio, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle, and the distant rumble of the promised storm finally gathering its strength. I'm Alex, his son. My temporary stay, intended to ease Dad into the quiet life, was stretching on, partly because watching Gary's escalating obsession felt like watching a lit fuse crawl towards dynamite. His golf cart had already made 2 slow, deliberate passes down our street in the last hour. The amber light painting pathetic streaks across the neighbors' perfect lawns. He followed you on your walk again today, didn't he? This isn't just quirky neighbor stuff anymore. It feels targeted. Dad sighed, swirling the melting ice in his glass of iced tea. He looked out towards the darkening woods bordering the subdivision, his gaze distant. Targeted harassment. His internal lexicon likely supplied. Subject fixation. Potential for escalation, moderate to high. He looked back at me, his expression weary. He's a pressure cooker, Alex. He repeated his earlier assessment, though his tone held less clinical detachment now, more concern. Feels small. So he tries to make others feel smaller. Classic bully playbook. He took a slow sip. The trick is not to let him see he's getting to you. Starve the fire. It burns out. But what if it doesn't burn out? Dad, I thought. The image of Gary's flushed, indignant face suddenly feeling more menacing than pathetic. What if it explodes? Gary Shipley didn't burn out. He intensified his campaign. The violations became more frequent, more absurd. A formal-looking notice of non-compliance taped to our front door cited unapproved horticultural illumination. The offending items. The standard issue. Low-voltage solar path, lights lining our walkway. Identical to those illuminating at least 20 other yards on our block. Another warning slip materialized after Dad spent a quiet Saturday afternoon meticulously changing the oil in his truck in our own driveway, an activity explicitly permitted by the HOA's own rules regarding minor vehicle maintenance. The slip alleged conducting unauthorized commercial vehicle repair activities in a residential zone. His methods grew bolder, more invasive. The shadowing during Dad's walks became less subtle. Gary would park his golf cart directly across the street, watching Dad weed the flower beds, his arms crossed, projecting an air of official surveillance. He started talking to other neighbors, his voice carrying deliberately. Miss S. Henderson, our kind elderly neighbor, 2 doors down, confided in me nervously one afternoon while retrieving her mail. Alex, dear, she'd whispered, glancing around furtively. Mr. Shipley was telling Mr. Gable yesterday that your father, well, he said he seemed awfully secretive. Asked if we knew what he really did before he retired. Said he had a suspicious vibe. She patted my arm. Don't you worry, dear. Nobody believes his nonsense. But he makes people uncomfortable. He seems so angry all the time. Her words confirmed my unease. Gary wasn't just being a nuisance. He was actively trying to poison the well, painting Dad as something sinister. The irony was a lead weight in my stomach. Frank Miller, the man who had faced down terrorists, rescued hostages, upheld the law under unimaginable pressure, now being slandered as suspicious by a man whose entire identity seemed cobbled together from a cheap polo shirt and delusions of grandeur. Dad's stoicism remained largely intact, a lifetime of training in emotional control holding firm. But the cracks were beginning to show. I saw it in the slight tightening of his jawline when Gary's golf cart whined past the house, the way his hand would clench momentarily on the handle of his garden trowel. The fraction of a second longer, his gaze lingered on Gary's retreating figure. Subject is attempting psychological intimidation, spreading disinformation. His internal analyst likely logged, maintain composure, document interactions. Avoid direct confrontation unless unavoidable. He remembered the faces of informants who'd cracked under pressure, the catastrophic consequences of losing control in a tense negotiation. This suburban battlefield was different, absurdly so, but the principles remained the same. Stay calm, stay alert. Don't let the antagonist dictate the terms of engagement. Yet, the sheer pettiness, the grinding persistence of it, seemed to wear on him in a way that bullets and bombs hadn't. This felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one delivered with smug, self-righteous glee. The breaking point arrived, as such things often do, on an utterly unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with humidity, pressing down like a damp blanket. The sky overhead was a bruised, moody gray, the promised storm still refusing to unleash its fury. Dad was in the front yard, engaged in a sweaty, protracted struggle with the deeply entrenched root system of an azalea bush that had decided to colonize the area beneath the mailbox. He'd been at it for nearly an hour, his gray t-shirt plastered to his back, beads of sweat tracing paths through the grime on his temples. The rhythmic thunk scrape of his shovel biting into the stubborn earth was the loudest sound on the quiet street. Then, the familiar, irritating whine. Gary Shipley's golf cart rounded the corner with unwarranted urgency, pulling up sharply at the curb, its amber light flashing its pointless SOS into the oppressive daylight. Gary hopped out, clipboard in hand, his face already flushed, radiating an aura of imminent confrontation. He strode onto the lawn, planting himself directly between Dad and the offending azalea. "Miller," Gary barked, dispensing with any pretense of neighborly greeting. "Cease and desist immediately. Unauthorized excavation." Dad straightened slowly, planting the shovel blade firmly in the soil. He used the back of his gloved hand to wipe sweat from his brow, his movements deliberate, measured, betraying no outward sign of annoyance. He glanced down at the modest hole, maybe 10 inches deep at its center, barely wider than the shovel blade. "Afternoon, Gary," he said, his voice level, calm. "Just trying to get this root out. It's cracking the sidewalk. Irrelevant," Gary snapped, puffing out his chest like an indignant pigeon. He took a step closer, violating Dad's personal space. HOA Architectural Review Committee regulations are explicit. Any soil displacement exceeding a depth of 6 inches requires a formal application and prior written approval. Bylaw 17. Section C. Paragraph 222. You received the handbook. Miller, ignorance is no excuse. Dad looked from the shallow hole to Gary's increasingly florid face. A flicker of something, profound weariness, perhaps, or maybe just disbelief at the sheer absurdity, crossed his features before being instantly masked. Subject escalating rapidly. The internal assessment likely ran. Posture aggressive. Voice volume increasing. Seeking dominance through rule citation. Minimal physical threat perceived. Yet, seems like a bit of an overreach for a garden root. "Gary," Dad said mildly, his voice retaining its infuriating calm. "Overreach. Rules are rules," Gary's voice cracked, ascending into a higher register. He jabbed a finger towards Dad. "You think you're special. You think you can just move in here and disregard the standards that maintain the integrity and property values of this community that everyone else adheres to." "No, Gary," Dad replied, his voice still maddeningly steady. "I just think this is a stubborn plant, and you seem disproportionately upset about it. I am issuing an immediate stop work order," Gary declared, brandishing his ballpoint pen like a dagger. He made frantic, stabbing motions at his clipboard. "And a formal citation. Non-compliance penalties will be applied. Daily." "Okay, Gary," Dad said, turning away slightly. A calculated gesture of dismissal. He bent down, grasping the exposed portion of the root again, preparing to give it another determined yank. "You do what you think you need to do." That dismissal, that quiet, final refusal to grant Gary the confrontation he so desperately craved, to acknowledge his self-proclaimed authority. It was like striking a match in a gas-filled room. Gary's face contorted, flushing a terrifying shade of purple. A vein pulsed violently in his temple. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Don't you dare turn your back on me," he shrieked, his voice raw, completely unhinged now. "I represent the HOA. I have authority here. You will show respect. You have a golf cart." "Gary," Dad said quietly, pulling hard on the root. It finally gave way with a tearing sound. "I have authority," Gary screamed again, the sound tearing through the humid air. And then, in a horrifying instant, the situation detonated with a sudden, spastic movement. Gary fumbled at the tactical fanny pack strapped around his waist, the pathetic centerpiece of his wannabe uniform. His hand emerged clutching a black, menacing shape, a taser, not the robust yellow X-26 Dad recognized from law enforcement, but a smaller, sleeker civilian model, easily available online. Its primary purpose, often intimidation rather than controlled takedown. Even Dad's honed reflexes, dulled slightly by retirement and surprise, couldn't react fast enough to the sheer unpredictability of the attack. Before he could fully process the insane escalation from verbal bluster to armed assault, Gary lunged forward. He closed the scant few feet between them and viciously jammed the taser's twin electrodes against Dad's exposed side, just above his hip, where his t-shirt had ridden up during the struggle with the root. The sound was sickening, intimate, and terrifyingly loud in the quiet afternoon. A sharp, Violent crackle snap as thousands of volts surged into flesh. It was followed immediately by a strangled, involuntary cry of pure agony ripped from Dad's throat. His body locked rigid for a split second, then collapsed onto the perfect green lawn as if poleaxed, limbs flailing uncontrollably in the brutal grip of neuromuscular incapacitation. The shovel clattered beside him, useless. The acrid, metallic stink of ozone, the smell of raw electricity burning the air, instantly filled the space around them. I saw it all from the kitchen window, my breath catching in my throat, the world narrowing to that horrifying tableau on the lawn. One moment, Dad was enduring Gary's tantrum. The next, he was on the ground, convulsing. A silent scream built inside me. I shoved away from the counter, bursting through the front door, the screen door banging shut behind me, terror lending wings to my feet. Gary stood over Dad's prone, twitching figure, the taser held loosely in his hand, still emitting a faint, menacing buzz. His face, previously contorted with rage, now wore an expression of grotesque, almost orgasmic triumph. Power finally, violently, asserted. Then his eyes snapped towards me as I sprinted across the lawn, barefoot on the hot pavement. The crazed glee vanished, replaced by a sudden flicker of panic. "He resisted!" Gary yelled, his voice high-pitched, defensive. "He assaulted me. I'm an HOA official. On duty. You saw it." He forced my hand. "It was self-defense." "Dad!" I skidded to my knees beside him, my hands hovering uselessly, afraid to touch him while he trembled. Gary and his pathetic justifications ceased to exist. Dad's eyes were squeezed shut, his face chalky white beneath the grime and sweat. Lines of agony etched around his mouth. His breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps. The violent convulsions were lessening, but fine tremors still racked his body. Angry red welts were already rising on his skin where the taser had made contact. "Get away from him!" I screamed at Gary, my voice raw with a mixture of fury and terror. "I'm calling 911. Get away." Gary shuffled backward, his bravado dissolving like sugar in rain. He glanced wildly around, perhaps seeking validation or support from the neighbors now emerging onto their porches, drawn by the scream and the commotion. But the faces staring back reflected only shock and horror. Mrs. Henderson had her hand clasped over her mouth. Mr. Gable looked pale and nauseated. No one looked supportive. I was just enforcing the bylaws," Gary stammered, his voice trailing off. Losing all conviction, he scrambled clumsily back into his golf cart. Then, with the final, panicked glance back at Dad's still figure and the horrified neighbors, he jammed the accelerator. The cart shot away down the street, weaving erratically for a moment before disappearing around the corner, its amber light still flashing its absurd, mocking pulse. He fled the scene, leaving my father injured on his own lawn. The next hour was a surreal blur of flashing lights, real ones this time, official voices, and the hushed, horrified murmurs of neighbors gathering at a respectful distance. 2 paramedics worked quickly, efficiently, checking Dad's vitals, applying cool compresses to the angry taser burns, asking him assessment questions he answered through gritted teeth. Took quite a jolt. One paramedic murmured to the other, examining the twin marks on Dad's side. They confirmed the taser use, but after careful assessment, determined he didn't need immediate hospitalization, advising rest, hydration, and careful monitoring. "Those muscle contractions are no joke," the lead paramedic told me seriously. "He'll be feeling this for days. Any dizziness, confusion, heart palpitations. Call us back immediately." Sergeant Riley and another officer arrived, their expressions grim as they took my statement. Then Dad's brief, clipped, delivered while sitting heavily on the porch steps, and statements from Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Gable, who both corroborated the confrontation, the taser, and Gary's flight. Assault with a dangerous weapon, Sergeant Riley stated flatly, snapping his notebook shut. Felony charge. His claims about HOA authority are completely irrelevant legally. You don't get to tase people over garden roots, official or not. He surveyed the quiet street. We've got an APB out for Shipley and the golf cart. He won't get far, based on multiple witnesses and the physical evidence. The DA will have a strong case. Later that evening, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion and simmering anger. Dad was settled on the couch, wrapped in an old FBI logo sweatshirt, despite the lingering warmth of the day, moving stiffly whenever he shifted position. The mask of calm retirement had been completely shattered, replaced by a tightly controlled stillness I recognized. The focused intensity of a man processing a threat, analyzing vulnerabilities, formulating a response. The violence of the attack, so unexpected in this tranquil setting, seemed to have reawakened dormant instincts. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen before dialing a number from memory, not his contacts list. Mike. "It's Frank Miller," he said into the phone, his voice low, devoid of inflection, but carrying a weight that made me sit up straighter. "Yeah, I'm functional, mostly." A pause. "Listen, ran into a local problem here today. Neighborhood guy, wannabe enforcer type, escalated things." Another pause as he listened. "Yeah, ended up deploying a taser on me." He stated it as fact, flatly, without drama. "Local PD is handling the assault charge. They're looking for him now." He listened again, his gaze fixed on the wall, but seeing something else entirely. "No, retired. I understand that. But weapon involved. Figured. Yeah, just wanted to give you a heads up. Might get tied up with statements. Potential court down the line." He nodded slowly. "Okay. Right. Appreciate it, Mike. Yeah. Talk soon." He ended the call, placing the phone carefully back on the end table. He caught my questioning gaze. "Mike Rourke," he explained, his voice carefully neutral, offering the same explanation as before. "My replacement as team lead back at HRT, just letting him know what happened. Standard procedure." It sounded reasonable. Except I knew my father. There was nothing standard procedure about that call. It wasn't just a heads up, it was a signal, launched across the quiet landscape of retirement, received by ears trained to recognize threats against their own. He hadn't asked for anything, but he had reported. And in his old world, reporting an assault with a weapon on one of their own, retired or not, triggered a response. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the air thick with unspoken tension. The promised rain had finally arrived overnight, leaving the lawns glistening and the air smelling clean. But the mood felt heavy. Gary Shipley's house remained dark and silent. His golf cart was nowhere to be seen. Sergeant Riley called Dad mid-morning. They hadn't located Shipley yet, but had secured a warrant for his arrest and were preparing to search his house. Dad thanked him, his voice courteous but revealing nothing of the call he'd made the night before. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing coffee, staring out at the rain-washed street, his movements still careful, betraying the lingering pain from the taser burns. He looked lost in thought, a deep furrow between his brows. Waiting, his internal voice likely murmured, waiting for the echo. Around 10 o.m., the echo arrived, not with the wail of local sirens, but with the quiet, imposing presence of federal authority. A dark gray Ford Expedition, immaculate, Government plates, barely visible through the light drizzle, glided silently to the curb across the street. Before its engine had fully settled, a second identical vehicle pulled in smoothly behind it. Then a third. They sat there for a moment, dark, anonymous, radiating a palpable sense of purpose. Doors opened, and men began to emerge, calmly, efficiently. No wasted movement. 4 from the first SUV, 3 from the second. They wore unobtrusive tactical pants, agency logo polo shirts, or lightweight jackets zipped against the drizzle. FBI embroidered discreetly in gold thread. Sleek body armor vests were worn externally, fitted and functional. They moved with a quiet coordination that spoke of endless drills and real-world experience. One carried a heavy ballistic shield, handling it with practiced ease. Another held a compact battering ram, its weight held ready, but not menacingly. Their eyes scanned the street, the houses, taking everything in, communicating with brief nods and subtle hand gestures. This wasn't the local PD responding to a neighborhood disturbance. This was HRT's operational cousins, arriving with surgical precision. They bypassed our house entirely, after a brief, silent conference on the sidewalk. Lasting no more than 10 seconds, the team moved as one unit down the street, turning the corner. Their destination clear, Gary Shipley's residence. Dad had risen from the table, drawn to the window as if by magnetism. He stood watching them go, his reflection pale in the rain-streaked glass. His expression was impossible to read, a turbulent mix of grim validation, a shadow of remembered adrenaline, perhaps the bittersweet pang of watching his old world intersect violently with his new one. "Well," he murmured. So softly I almost didn't hear him. Looks like Mike dispatched the follow-up. A moment later, a voice, amplified but calm, devoid of emotion, carried back through the damp air, cutting through the sound of the rain. "Gary Shipley, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a federal warrant. Open the door." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof. Even the neighborhood dogs seemed to sense the tension, falling quiet. "Gary Shipley, this is the FBI. Open the door now or entry will be forced." More silence. Then a sharp, definitive crack echoed down the street. The unmistakable sound of a reinforced door yielding to concentrated force. The FBI team melted through the breach, disappearing inside the house that Gary had used as his command post for his reign of petty terror. The subsequent wait felt stretched thin, each second thick with anticipation. Maybe 45 seconds passed, maybe a minute. Then, the front door opened again, and the team emerged. 2 large agents held Gary Shipley securely between them. His arms were cuffed behind his back. Gone was the HOA uniform, the lanyard, the fanny pack. He wore stained sweatpants and a faded T-shirt, his hair wild, his face chalk white and slack with terror. The bulging eyes were wide now, darting frantically, seeing everything and nothing. The bully, stripped bare of his pathetic props and confronted with overwhelming, legitimate force, looked utterly insignificant, a deflated balloon of malice. They marched him quickly, unceremoniously, towards one of the waiting expeditions. The solid, metallic thunk of the heavy door closing sealed his fate, echoing like a judge's gavel in the quiet, rain-washed street. One figure detached himself from the agents securing the house and walked briskly across the wet lawns towards our porch. Mike Rourke, lean, watchful eyes, carrying the quiet competence that seemed to be standard issue in Dad's former line of work. Dad opened our front door before Mike reached the steps, meeting him under the small overhang, out of the worst of the rain. They shook hands, Not a casual greeting, but a firm, brief grip that spoke volumes. Years of shared risk, unspoken loyalty, mutual respect. "Frank," Mike said, his voice low, keeping it professional, but his eyes scanning Dad's face with concern. "Glad to see you're in one piece. Heard about the taser?" His gaze flicked momentarily to Dad's side. "Not how we expected your retirement to play out." He offered a wry, humorless smile. "Assaulting a federal officer, even a retired one, especially one with your history, with a prohibited weapon, tends to light up a few flags downtown. Just a neighborhood idiot who lost his temper," Dad said, instinctively minimizing. "He wasn't actually affiliated with the HOA, was he?" Mike snorted, shaking his head. "Not a chance. We pulled his file the minute you hung up. Gary Allen Shipley, dishonorably discharged from a two-bit security firm years ago. Fired from 2 subsequent guard jobs for excessive zeal and impersonating law enforcement. Zero connection to your HOA board, other than maybe complaining to them." He gestured back towards Shipley's house. "Bought the taser online, shipped from out of state. Got the uniform stuff from a costume supply website. Seems he had a whole fantasy life built around being an enforcer." Mike's expression hardened. "We also found 2 unregistered handguns, a sawed-off shotgun, and enough fake badges to stock a Hollywood prop department. Plus, turns out he has a prior felony assault conviction from Nevada from 15 years ago. Makes him a prohibited person." "So, federal charges?" Dad asked, his voice quiet. "Bank on it." Mike confirmed grimly. "Assault on a former federal officer, felon in possession of multiple firearms, illegal acquisition and interstate transport of the taser. Possibly wire fraud if he used HOA letterhead he wasn't entitled to. The U.S. Attorney is already lining up the indictment. He's looking at serious time in federal custody. He won't be bothering Oak Ridge Landing or anywhere else for a long, long while." Mike clapped Dad gently on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that transcended rank and retirement status. "Team sends their best, Frank." They were displeased to hear what happened. Message was clear. "They've still got your 6. He met Dad's gaze, a flicker of shared understanding passing between them, the unspoken language of men who had faced down darkness together. "Anything else comes up, anything at all, you make the call. Directly. Appreciate it, Mike," Dad said simply, the 2 words carrying a wealth of meaning. "Tell the team, stay safe." Mike nodded, gave a brief, almost imperceptible salute, and turned back towards the waiting vehicles. Within minutes, the FBI convoy pulled away as silently and efficiently as it had arrived, leaving behind a bewildered cluster of neighbors peering from windows and doorways, and the splintered remnants of Gary Shipley's front door. Sergeant Riley arrived soon after, looking both impressed and slightly overwhelmed, as he began coordinating with the departing federal agents. The local assault case now folded into a much larger federal investigation. The aftermath within Oak Ridge Landing was swift and predictable. The official HOA board, jolted out of its complacency, went into overdrive, issuing frantic emails and statements disavowing Gary Shipley, condemning his actions in the strongest possible terms, and emphasizing his complete lack of any official standing. They faced a firestorm of criticism from residents, angry that Shipley's escalating pattern of harassment and intimidation had been ignored or tolerated for so long. Lawsuits were threatened, demanding accountability from the board for negligence. New, significantly stricter protocols for verifying any official HOA communications and clearly identifying authorized personnel were hastily implemented. The reign of the wannabe warden was decisively over. Gary Shipley, facing a daunting array of federal charges, accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. The judge, citing his prior felony conviction, the calculated nature of his impersonation, the severity of the unprovoked assault on a retired federal officer, and his utter lack of remorse, sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, ensuring he would be well into his 60s before tasting freedom again. Dad also filed a civil suit, easily winning a substantial default judgment against Shipley. The house that had served as Gary's castle, his beige fortress of delusion, was seized and sold at auction, the proceeds covering Dad's legal expenses and damages, a final, ignominious end to his Oak Ridge Landing tyranny. Retirement hadn't unfolded with the quiet predictability Dad had envisioned. The taser incident left its mark, a physical stiffness that took weeks to fully dissipate, but also a deeper, psychic bruise. It was a jarring, unwelcome reminder that violence wasn't neatly compartmentalized in the past, confined to the high-stakes world he'd left behind. It could erupt anywhere, even on a manicured suburban lawn, over something as mundane as a garden route, wielded by someone as pathetic as Gary Shipley. But the ugly incident also yielded an unexpected gift, a profound affirmation of loyalty. The swift, decisive, almost overwhelming response from Mike Rourke and the Bureau wasn't just about regulations or jurisdiction. It was about belonging. It was the silent, powerful reassurance of a brotherhood forged in fire, a bond unbroken by retirement or distance. They still had his six. That knowledge seemed to settle something deep within him. He returned to his routines, but with a subtle shift. The meticulous care of his tomato plants felt less like filling time, more like nurturing life. The patient sanding and assembling of birdhouses seemed imbued with a quiet sense of purpose. The satisfying rumble of his Triumph motorcycle warming up in the garage sounded like freedom. The oppressive presence of Gary's golf cart, the irritating flash of its amber light, was gone, replaced by the familiar, comforting symphony of suburban life. Lawnmowers, sprinklers, children's laughter. One cool evening, weeks after the dust had settled, I found him standing in the front yard near the azaleas, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and violet. The air felt clean, washed by the earlier rain. He reached down, his hand hovering for a moment before gently touching a smooth, green leaf on the azalea bush, near the spot where the troublesome root had been dug out and the assault had occurred. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of victory or vengeance, but one of quiet, profound contentment, of peace meticulously reclaimed, fiercely defended, and finally, truly settled. Oak Ridge Landing slumbered on in its beige tranquility, perhaps unaware of the silent battles fought and won on its manicured lawns. But Dad knew. The garden, his small patch of hard-won earth, was safe now, truly his own.